Hey guys, it's RodimusPrimal. I am back with another video, and today I have got a special treat for you guys. So happy Thanksgiving. I have none other than the talented, the guy who created the very foundation of what we know of with Transformers. That is legendary comic book writer and artist too, and story editor and much more for Marvel Comics. And that is Bob Budiansky. How you doing there?
I'm doing just fine.
All right.
How are you, Joe?
But yeah, so we're gonna have an awesome time. We're gonna talk about his life, his experiences through Marvel, and where he's going on from here. So without further ado, sit back, relax, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and let's transform and roll out. So Bob, let's start it off right where from the basic foundations. Where you're from, where were you born? Where'd you grow up, and how'd you end up in Marvel Comics? I know it's like a long-winded question.
That covers a lot of territory.
It does.
So well, I was born and grew up in the Bronx, New York City.
Fellow New Yorker.
And I went to college in the University of Buffalo. And while I was working at University of Buffalo, I always had an interest. I mean, when I was a kid, I used to read comic books voraciously. Up until high school anyway. So I always had an interest in comics. I used to draw a lot when I was a kid. And I imagined that one day I could become an artist for a major comic book company. And then as I got older, I thought that was unrealistic. But meanwhile, I went to college. And while I was at college, I joined the college newspaper staff as a staff artist. I have some art talent. So I became the graphic arts editor eventually. And while I was there, I met other people on the newspaper staff. And eventually, the year I graduated, a friend of mine, the arts editor, meaning like the guy who did all the movie reviews and so on, a person named Jay Boydar, he wound up going to New York City and landing a job at Marvel Comics as an editorial assistant in the Marvel British department. And he knew of my interest in comic books and artwork and so on. So I continued for a master's program. During my holiday break, I think spring break, I went down to visit Jay. He invited me up to the Marvel offices. I met people there. Certainly had an interest in working there, but I was finishing up a master's program in transportation engineering at that time. Eventually, at the end of my first year of master's program in May of 1976, Jay quit his job to get another job. He was not that big into comic books. He just wanted to get some kind of a position in Manhattan so he can move on to something more in his field, which is what he did. And he asked me if I wanted to interview for his job. And I did over the telephone. And with Jay's help and a couple other people I had met and their recommendations and they're having a decent interview, I got the job. I became the new Marvel editorial assistant for the Marvel British department. And, and that's how I got started at Marvel. And my first boss was Larry Lieber, Stan Lee's brother.
Okay.
And so I learned a lot. And then I don't want to get into all the boring details, but it's not Transformers related, but I went freelance, I did artwork, I went back on staff and so on and so forth. And eventually, in 1983, I was invited back on staff to become a full editor. By that time, I guess I had proven my value. I was more than just a guy doing photocopies for my boss. I was now capable of doing more. So the editor-in-chief at the time, Jim Shooter, who also played a significant role with the Transformers.
Yep.
He invited me back on staff as a full editor. And then several months later, Marvel and Hasbro made some kind of deal. I was not involved at the time. They made some kind of deal for Marvel to develop this new property that Hasbro was rolling out, no pun intended, called the Transformers. And they wanted Marvel to develop that property as Marvel had developed G.I. Joe a couple of years earlier and come up with a storyline and characters and so on and so forth. So at that point, Jim Shooter, he assigned himself the job of writing the treatment or the backstory for the Transformers, which he did as part of his day job. He didn't take an extra penny for it. Mm-hmm. That is the basis for all of the Transformers mythology that followed. And then he asked a senior editor with a lot of writing experience to develop the characters. So the initial toy line had 26 Transformers in it. Yep. So he wanted 26 names and character profiles to submit to Hasbro for their approval. And again, I am not involved yet, so this is all kind of like hearsay, second nature, what I've heard. But Jim told me himself, he did not approve of what was turned into him. And rather than go back to that editor-writer and say, can you revise all of this? he just took the job and moved on with it to other people. He didn't want to, for whatever reasons. I don't know.
Was that kind of normal at Marvel, like to do that, like to kind of like if you were kind of like, hey, can you try and see how this works for you, and then if it doesn't work, we can see another.
I don't want to presuppose what Jim's thinking was, but it was very typical that if you turn in a job and your editor thinks it's inadequate, the editor would go back to you and say, here are the problems I see. Can you please revise it with this in mind? And he didn't do that. Again, I wasn't part of that conversation. I'm not going to try to speculate on why he didn't do it. Instead, what he did was he went down Editor's Row, which is a series of offices, one editor's office after another, not one by one, but he went down several different offices where there were editors who had a lot of writing experience, and he went and asked them if they would be interested in taking these characters and coming up with new names and new character profiles in a very short period of time. I know the first person he asked was Larry Hama, who was the guy who developed
G.I. Joe.
G.I. Joe, and Larry turned him down. He went to a couple of other people, I believe, and they turned him down because he was only giving them about 4 or 5 days to do all this work.
Right.
In fact, coincidentally, it was the weekend right before Thanksgiving.
It's pretty much
which was like this time. This past couple of days.
Yeah.
He came down Editor's Row probably around Wednesday of the week before Thanksgiving, Wednesday or maybe Thursday. I think it was a Wednesday. And he was being turned down one after another. And basically the job was come up with all these profiles and new names and turn it in on Monday before Thanksgiving. And as you can imagine, Thanksgiving is a short work week, first of all.
Right.
Some people are making plans to go traveling and visit their families or whatever. So a lot of people were not interested in taking on this job for this thing they never heard of and doing all this work. But it came to me finally, and I didn't have a reputation as a writer editor. I was an artist editor. But again, as an act of pure desperation, Jim Shooter came to me and said, Bob, do you want to give this a try? So I said, sure, I'm not doing anything this weekend. So over that weekend before Thanksgiving of 1983, I came up with 24 out of 26 of the names. 2 of the names we kept from the previous writer, which included Optimus Prime, and I think the other one was Prowl.
Okay.
And I wrote up all the character profiles. I handed it in on Monday. I guess Jim had a deadline to get it to Hasbro before Thanksgiving.
Okay.
So he reviewed it, he liked it, and it moved on to Hasbro, and they liked it. And then I was part of the Transformers universe for the next 5 or so years.
There you go. So the question I have for you, when they first handed you all this stuff, did they hand you the toys or did they hand you images?
Toys.
Yeah, so that you actually did get to see what the toys looked like. Did you have to try to figure out like what they were? Did you get pictures of what they were supposed to be, or you had to figure it out?
I don't think I really had to. I think I don't remember exactly. I might have been told what they turned into. I don't think I sat there playing with them.
Okay.
But as you and I'm sure much of your audience is probably aware, initially Hasbro made deals with 2 Japanese toy companies to repurpose these pre-existing toys and just call them Transformers.
Yeah, Takara. For those, the initial set was actually Takara was the Japanese company, and they made 2 different toy lines, and they took the 2 toy lines for the first 26.
Yeah,
and then in 1985, when they came up with the next wave, they started pulling from other toy lines from Japan, like ones from Bandai and a bunch of other ones. So I keep up on that stuff. And then by 86, Hasbro was like direct with Takara, just making Transformers. Mm-hmm. So, but that initial set was directly from Takara's Diaclone and Micro Change toy lines. So I know names are gonna go over your head, but it's
you know far more about the background than I do.
Yeah, that's what it is. Like I try my best to keep up with this stuff, and like there are certain characters. Like I always hear about the story about Megatron. How you came up with the name and Hasbro didn't like it, and then that one's a fun one if you want to tell it.
That's a good story. So. Okay, so I'm working with Hasbro. I'm turning in all these names. Just a little side note, any name I turned in, whether they liked it assuming they liked it, it still had to go through the legal department to make sure the name was available, that there wasn't any potential trademark or copyright problem with it for somebody else was using it. So I would turn in names. I would turn in alternate names in case they needed a backup, in case the first name I submitted got rejected. Anyway, in case of Megatron, that was rejected by Hasbro for a very interesting reason. I was told by the product manager at the time, or the account manager, whatever her title was, that they thought it was too scary. So I understood that this is their property. They get to make the rules and make the decisions, and I'm fine with that. But I really liked the name Megatron. I thought it had a great sound to it, and it really captured what I was going for with that particular.
Leader of the bad guys.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. So I said to the Hasbro person, I said, well, here's the thing. You know, I understand you don't like the name; it's too scary, but he's supposed to be scary. He's the head of the bad guys, and it was like, oh, I didn't think of it that way. You know, so I guess they reconsidered their decision over there in the Hasbro executive headquarters or whatever, and they said, okay, we'll allow Megatron. I guess they weren't used to putting out characters who were bad guys, you know, who had scary names.
They had the only other toy company, the toy brand I think they had at the time was G.I. Joe.
Right.
And the G.I. Joe had Cobra, who were their bad guys. And Larry Hama, I think, you know, came up with all of the character. I think a lot of the character names for them. So
yeah.
And you know, coming up with different good guys and bad guys. So like that's the thing. Like when you're coming up with different names, one of the names that always comes up for people, like I actually made an entire video on this, was a character by the name of Bluestreak, which is an interesting case because the toy that came out was gray, but the original prototype was blue. And so everybody makes a big deal about it because you named him Bluestreak.
Yeah.
But the name Bluestreak works because he's a chatterbox. He's like me. I can talk all night. You know.
Well, I certainly, you know, if I came up with a name and it has some kind of connotation, I would certainly tie that into their personality to some degree. And like as you just pointed out, I was given a certain kind of reference that showed him as being blue, which suggested blue streak, you know, because blue streak has so many good connotations. Like it sounds like a fast character. I think Bluestreak's a car.
It was a silver car in the.
There you go. So he's a car. He's fast. And he talks to Bluestreak. So it had all these great connotations. And then they changed the color of the character to a gray. So what can I do?
Yeah,
out of my control. But I worked. You know, I did what I could. I worked with what I was given.
Yeah,
did what I could.
And I think personally, like the names that you would come up with, their personalities, like their bios, like you think about, like now you came up with the idea of the tech specs as well.
Yeah,
that's an interesting one. That's a pretty cool, like the whole they put the whole decoder thing on there, I guess.
That's
like
their idea. Yes.
Yeah, but
torture all of you collectors, all you kids, into looking through that red piece of cellophane and figuring out what you're looking at.
Yeah, but you just had the numbers on there for the
which wasn't an original idea, but I adapted it. Marvel had recently put out the Marvel Universe series handbooks, which is like a compendium of information on all Marvel characters. And the person behind that, editor Mark Grunwald, he came up with the idea. I think it was his idea of putting in power ratings for all the characters, of strength and intelligence and speed, etc.
Yeah, and
I just adapted that idea and put it onto Transformers.
Were there any characters that when you were making those bios, those numbers and stuff like that, that some people think that they don't necessarily match? Specifically, I know that this might be a number that goes over your head, but the 3 jets was Starscream, Thundercracker, and Skywarp. And if you look at their ranks and their numbers, they seem a little crisscrossed, just based on what they were wearing on the toys. So I don't know if that was like in their like a Hasbro mess up.
No, I don't know about that. I really don't know. That's a little bit too detailed for me. But as I recall, those 3 jets were identical. They were just painted different.
Yeah.
So I think I was going for something that was relatively similar between the 3 as far as their power ratings go. Maybe I made one a little stronger, one a little faster or something. I don't really recall. It's been a long time. But I really was trying to keep them sort of similar. And I know over the years, I mean, well, actually, it wasn't even years, but somehow Starscream, took prominence among those 3.
Yeah.
And that's fine. I think if I had one character was a breakout character. I'm looking for the original text specs. I have it right here.
Okay.
And then I could show it to your audience, and I could maybe remind myself of why something was written one way or the other. Hold on. I'll get it. Here it is. So here it is in my own personal handwriting.
Wow.
Graph paper chart. That's the original. And then I just had a much cleaner version of it, which I just lost in this mess here.
It's okay. My office is a disaster too.
So Hasbro was so impressed that they had somebody at their office rewrite my chart into much more legible in a much more legible way.
Wow, that's so cool.
Okay.
That is so cool.
That's the original 26 Transformers and their tech specs. So now I'm looking at Starscream, Thundercracker, and Skywarp, which are right at the top, and their specs are fairly similar. Well, I did use Starscream a much higher rank than Thundercracker or Skywarp. So even then, I broke them out as that. I gave them a rank of 9, and Thundercracker and Skywarp are only 5s. So,
okay.
So
yeah. Well, I think
on
the toy itself, I think Starscream was actually listed lower. I think I could be wrong, but
oh, I don't know. You can see Starscream, Thundercracker.
If you go,
you can't see the names and the categories on the top there, but
okay.
You can see exactly what I wrote. How many years ago now? 38 years.
Yeah, I know. It's like it's going so many years ago. But still, but
that's it.
Yeah, that is so cool. That is very cool. Because a lot of people always get who they are and mismatched, and as you're coming up with the characters, because they think about things like, okay, this character is this one's brother, or this one is this character's this, and we on the fans we grow attached to it, because it's like we grow attached to so many of these characters. It's not just the Transformers, but I think it might be just a Marvel thing,
Well, the reason I put it on this piece of graph paper originally was so I could compare everybody, because I knew what the toys looked like and which toys looked bigger and stronger and faster, and so I tried to keep everything relative. Like I wasn't going to make Bumblebee, as strong as Optimus Prime, for
of course not.
So that's an extreme example of what I was going for. Like I had to put it all on a piece of graph paper so I could compare and mix and match and figure out where each character belonged under each power rating. And and here we are 38 years later. It's like engraved in stone, these ratings, right?
Yeah, and it's one of the coolest things to know that that information, like all the stuff that you created, and it's not just those original characters. Like you kept on writing profiles for until 89, I think, while you were still writing
89. Yeah, I named about 250 characters. Wow. And wrote profiles for them as well.
Yeah. How did you keep track of so many of like making sure that a character was their bio matched their, it's just because you're very organized.
I probably didn't keep track of it as much as you think I did. I would just, let me just put this back here. The one thing that, as as anybody who collected Transformers knows, is Hasbro kept putting out new Transformers with new looks, new transformations. They came out with the Target Masters and the Power Masters and the Tripticons. They all had different ways of combining. So I was able to take all of these new characteristics and come up with new ideas as I wrote these bios. And so hopefully I didn't repeat myself, because I didn't have the same material I was working with a few years earlier. I had new material with new characteristics. I don't believe every time I wrote a new bio, I looked back at the previous 183 to make sure I wasn't repeating myself. So,
well, I honestly don't think that you didn't, because every single one of them has such a unique, personality. And anytime someone takes one of your profiles and uses it to write a story, you're able to create an interesting story out of that character profile. And he did such a good job of that. And I think that it's one of those things that for anyone who's a Transformers fan, could grasp onto, is that how you created this universe and you don't even realize how important it is, to
well,
so
at the time it was an assignment, I didn't know that all these years later Transformers would still be a thing,
right?
So I was just trying to do a good job. And since you mentioned these bios and how they've survived, this is what I did for bios. This is my original handwritten on a yellow legal pad bio for Ravage.
Wow.
That's how I was just spitting these out left and right, because that's what the job demanded. Here's a whole pile of these things.
Wow.
See?
Yeah.
Each one of those sheets of paper is a different profile.
Ratchet's an interesting one. I will say that one, because you initially intended Ratchet to be the nurse.
Yeah.
Then,
Ratchet became that was the ambulance, right?
Yeah, the ambulance.
So I kept, it was a medical thing. I wanted to come up with something that had a medical connotation. So Ratchet had a double meaning. One of the meanings has been lost in time, probably, but one meaning is Ratchet is a tool that you fix things with. You use it to fix things.
Right.
The tool. And the other thing is Nurse Ratchet from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yep.
Which was a popular book many, many years ago, and was a movie in the 1970s or 80s, Jack Nicholson. And Nurse Ratchet was actually a nurse, but she was also kind
She was
of
insane. She was nuts.
Yeah, a little bit severe.
Yeah.
She was kind of the villain in that. But I just wanted to, but she was a nurse. So I just wanted to use that connotation, that double connotation of a tool that fixes things and a nurse, and made Ratchet the name for it.
You know how circular things are? One of the actors in that movie, in the movie version, Scatman Crothers, was the voice of Jazz in the cartoon for Transformers.
Oh, well, cool.
Yeah. So like it's literally full circle. Like everything, like I guess, kind of crosses over in that way. And so like, because the character of Jazz, like, was he loved music, he loved it, arts and stuff. So they picked the perfect guy for it.
They picked a guy with a jazzy voice, like somebody
exactly.
Been hanging out in jazz clubs in smoke-filled rooms for the last 50 years.
Oh yeah. And his voice was amazing. His voice was amazing.
Like, yeah.
So, and now, so another question is, with it being a Marvel book, how did the connection to the Marvel end up becoming part of the Transformers with Spider-Man and with the Savage Land? Like, how did that? I know this story has been told 100 times, but talking about Spider-Man in issue 3, and how did that come about?
So in issue 3, my writer was Jim Salicrup for that issue, and Jim Salicrup was also the editor of the Spider-Man books at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So Jim suggested, had nothing to do with the Transformers story. We just had everything to do with trying to sell the Transformers. We didn't know it was going to be a huge hit. So he said, why don't we feature Spider-Man as a guest star in Transformers, who, might pull in some extra readers and sell a few extra books. I said, okay, sure. He's a Spider-Man editor, so he knows who to ask for permission, which is himself, to be Spider-Man. So I said, sure. And then Hasbro rejected the idea. Because the reason they rejected the idea was because at the time, Marvel had a licensing deal with a rival toy company, not Hasbro, to produce action figures, and Spider-Man was one of them. And so the way Hasbro interpreted featuring Spider-Man in a Transformers comic book was that will help the sales of our rival toy companies sell more action figures than Spider-Man.
Right.
They didn't want to. I mean, I think it was kind of a stretch to think that way, but but that's how toy people think, I guess. You can't do anything that might help the competition. So they rejected Spider-Man, which kind of shocked us. We thought we were doing them a tremendous favor by even suggesting that we would use our Marvel's flagship character in their toy book, which we had no faith would last more than the 4-issue miniseries. So anyway, they rejected it, and then Jim Salicrup came up with a brilliant way to allow Spider-Man to still be featured in the book, which was recently at that time, Spider-Man had a new costume, a black and white costume.
Yep, the symbiote.
The Secret Wars costume.
Mm-hmm.
And so he said, why don't we put him in the black and white costume? Because the other toy company only has a license to produce Spider-Man in his traditional red and blue costume. So when we presented that to Hasbro, they agreed we can use Spider-Man.
Okay.
So that's how Spider-Man got in the book. Not because the story demanded it, just because Jim thought it would be a good selling point, and we got
it. Was because one of my friends that was actually there, I was so excited to have you sign issue 3 for him, which I have my copy over there.
Yes.
That was his first foray into the Transformers, was that issue. So it goes by Patriot Prime. So like he was so excited that issue 3 had Spider-Man on it. He goes, I'm buying it. Of what are these robots? It's so cool. Then he ends up getting into the whole Marvel Comics of Transformers. So and then of course the Savage Land is like something that, I mean, for me it's X-Men. When I think of the Savage Land, I think X-Men. But you had Shockwave and the Dinobots, have a history with the Savage Land. Yet later on in the book, the Marvel Comics and Transformers split. Like there was no mention of Marvel stuff in the Transformers books. Was that intentional, or was that just kind of like licensing deals that you wanted to make sure you kept things separate?
Well, I realized, I think at the beginning I was a little bit, naive, like, oh yeah, we'll put Spider-Man in here and so on. But I kind of realized, Transformers really needs to live in its own universe as we moved along, because the idea of these giant robots walking, I shouldn't say robots, these giant mechanical beings, alien beings, kind of ravaging, all over Earth, just having these battles and showing up here and there. And none of the other Marvel superheroes pay any attention to them. They really need to exist separately. I shouldn't be pulling in Marvel guest stars to the book. And certainly as Transformers went on, its own mythology developed more and more. So there was plenty of room to do a lot of stuff with Transformers without featuring Marvel characters. So the early appearances that you cited, I already explained Spider-Man. The Savage Land I brought in because if you know the backstory of the Transformers, at that time it basically was this spaceship from Cybertron crash lands on Earth.
4 million years ago. Yep.
All the Autobots and Decepticons that are on Earth were in the spaceship. Okay, and then Hasbro sells a lot of toys, and they say, "Hey, we have another generation of Transformers to introduce into the comic book." And I'm thinking, well, how do I introduce more characters? We have this spaceship. It wasn't like we forgot there's another room in the spaceship with some more characters in it. More Transformers. I have to come up with new ways to introduce more characters. Mm-hmm. So I came up with a couple of different ways, and one of them, specifically because it was the Dinobots, I was aware that in the Marvel universe, the Savage Land was the only place where dinosaurs still roamed.
Right.
And so I figured, okay, well, maybe there's a story I can have the Dinobots come from the Savage Land somehow, and they've imitated dinosaurs because that's what was there. And I forget the details, but that's how that evolved into using the Savage Land. It was just a way to introduce Dinobots. If the Dinobots were not Dinobots, if they were mammal bots, they probably wouldn't have used the Savage Land, but they were Dinobots. So
gotcha.
That's how.
So it just more so it was a convenience thing more than anything else.
Yeah, it was just trying to explain. I don't want to get too much into the weeds about it, but when you think about why do alien creatures feel the need to imitate a Volkswagen Bug or a Chevy or Camaro or whatever. What compels them to want to imitate what we are? And so in this case, it was dinosaurs.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that if I remember the way that it was originally written, where it said that it was the computer ship thought they were the dominant life form.
Oh, okay.
So
sounds like a good idea, Kim.
Yeah. And so the idea that it was the dominant life form because the robots are this when they turn into vehicles, that's they think that's the dominant life form is that. And I think when you started writing it, because you were editor for the first 4 issues, and then from issue 5 you continued writing, you had Shockwave was like, you didn't even see the human passing by. You have to fix your eyes. It's kind of like one of the things there. Speaking of Shockwave, that character is wildly different depending upon what continuity you follow. But when you wrote him in the Marvel comics, he usurped Megatron. Was that your original intention? Because he's, how would I put this? Shockwave in particular, was more leader of the Decepticons than Megatron was.
It's been so long, I don't exactly remember my original intention, but what I do remember is that I wanted to begin the regular series now that the miniseries was wrapped up with a big literal bang. So you have that wonderful cover that Mark Bright painted of the Autobots are all dead or whatever,
right?
Whatever it says. I wanted it to be a very impressive debut for this issue 5, and so I brought in Shockwave as the new character, and he blasts all the Autobots, and I guess he was able to brush aside Megatron. But I just remember that I wanted him to make a big impression.
Okay,
I think he did.
You did. He for a lot of people, Shockwave in the comics is their definitive Shockwave, because of the way that he was written as you were telling your stories. Who would you say is your one of the questions I get asked a lot, who you liked, who was your favorite Decepticon to write for? Because I know who your favorite Autobot is, and I'm going to talk about him next, but who you liked, who was your favorite Decepticon to write for? Because I know who your favorite Autobot is, and I'm going to talk about him next, but
I guess this kind of goes toward the problem of writing the Transformers. There was such a turnover of characters.
Yeah.
Because Hasbro was always pumping out more and more toys, and I was expected to introduce them into the storyline, which meant I had to put aside other characters.
Yeah.
I didn't get really connected to a lot of characters as I was writing them because they didn't last very long in the narrative I was constructing. Mm-hmm. But I do remember enjoying writing some of the later issues that I wrote with Starscream. I really had fun writing Starscream.
Okay. Yeah, that whole Underbase Saga is
exactly.
So
That was a lot of fun to write that.
And then turning Ratbat into leader of the Decepticons.
Yeah, I think that kind of really, people who were following the story were probably really thrown for a loop because up until that point you had these power crazy Megatron type character or this dominant Shockwave type character, and then Ratbat was basically based on an accountant personality.
Okay.
So he was more interested in I don't care about destroying this or that. I want results. I want the bottom line here to look better. Where's my energy? Where are you going to get energy from? And so he had a whole different approach of leading the Decepticons. He wasn't so interested in destruction and so on. He wanted results. He wanted, they were there for a purpose. The purpose was to, suck all the energy out of the earth and become more powerful and so on. And so that was his. I remember at the time when I was writing it, there were stories in the newspapers about how Hollywood studios had been taken over and the creative people who used to run the Hollywood studios had been pushed aside and accountants had taken over the Hollywood studios. They didn't care about the creativity of the movie. They just cared about the box office if it brought in money. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to base a character.
Welcome to 2021 because it's the same thing happening today.
Well, yeah, I think that's always been the case in Hollywood to some extent or other. But anyway, that was some of the stories that were appearing in the newspapers and magazines at that time when I was writing Ratbat.
Well, then we can know that he's a corporatist. He's a Hollywood executive.
He's a bean counter, isn't he?
Yeah. That's the best way to look at him. And then you're the one character that I know you're very proud of writing is Blaster.
Yeah.
And one of the most gut wrenching but a well appreciated stories was the story that when he came to Earth and having to fight Straxus. And he's a very different character than what you think of, because Blaster was sold by the toy company, when Hasbro sold him as the basically answer to Soundwave, because the two of them were both cassette players.
Mm-hmm.
But Blaster, you turned him into a noble warrior. How did when you were looking at that, was it the size of the toy maybe, I guess, that you had it, or how did you when you were coming up with the idea behind making him such an important character? Because I know you had a lot of fun writing for him. I'm trying to get into your head, I guess, as far as when you were writing that storyline.
Well, you have to really dig deep into my head. It's been a while, but the thing about Blaster was, again, I had to introduce new characters. Mm-hmm. So I came up with a new storyline that took place on Cybertron.
Right.
I hadn't featured up until that point in any of my stories in any prominent way. There might have been a couple of flashbacks, but that was it. But this one was actually based on Cybertron, which allowed me to introduce a whole bunch of new characters. I don't think Blaster had been featured up until that point.
Not yet.
So I don't know why I decided that of the characters I was going to be introducing on the Autobot side, that Blaster would be the prominent one. He'd be the one to take the lead. Mm-hmm. But maybe I just like the look of him. I think he has kind of he had that really cool helmet, visor on his head, and I just really loved his look. And I really can't say exactly why it was him over the others, but I picked him. I think in his personality profile, I don't have it in front of me, but basically I was basing it on Clint Eastwood movies.
Okay.
Clint Eastwood characters. And so I liked that personality for that story that I was constructing in my head.
Okay.
So it was a good merger of story and character, and Blaster was that nexus of the two.
Yeah. He's his character, even after his introduction on Cybertron, his story continued, even fought Grimlock for leadership. Then he kind of took second fiddle once Optimus Prime came back, and then he had that big Starscream arc at the end, towards the Underbase. Now, with that Underbase Saga, was that supposed to be your magnum opus, because that you killed so many Transformers in one issue? I'm a pretty bloodthirsty writer.
Well, here a couple of things were going on. Number one was, I'm approaching issue number 50. I know it's going to be a double-sized issue. Something big's supposed to happen when you do an issue number 50.
Right.
Number one. Number two is, as I've alluded to on a few occasions already, Hasbro kept introducing more and more product.
Right.
More toys that became more characters that I had to introduce into the series. And rather than have a series with 10 Autobots and 10 Decepticons, now, I had 30 or 40 or 50 on each side. It's it was unwieldy.
Okay.
There were just too many characters to keep track of. And so I decided I'm going to clean house. All that Hasbro cared about, and it wasn't like I got specific orders from Hasbro, get rid of this character, get rid of that character. But I knew the only characters that Hasbro really cared about were the characters that were in production. If the toy had been discontinued, they didn't care if that character ever was featured again in a comic book. They really didn't care. All they cared about was that their current line of toys would show up in one way or another, throughout the issues I wrote. So I had, I knew I had kind of a free pass to do what I wanted with these characters that were kind of forgotten, by Hasbro. And so I constructed a story where there would be a big major battle, a lot of guys would get totaled, and it would be a big conclusion, where in this case Starscream gets the power of the Underbase, and as prophecy, as I think that's Optimus Prime himself warned, no one, or maybe it was somebody talking to Optimus Prime.
I think it was Boltax.
No one heard
the name of
it. Was
it.
that?
I think it was Boltax. I think it was like some like ancient Cybertronian.
I think you're right. It was Boltax, which I have a story about too. But anyway, it was warned that no one being could contain the power of the Underbase, and so Starscream proved that to be true. So I was basing also this wanton destruction on growing up reading Metal Men, DC Comics Metal Men.
Okay.
In the 1960s, in virtually every issue of the Metal Men, they would get destroyed. By the end of the issue, they were just like lying in little pieces, or in the case of Mercury, little globules on the ground. And Doc Magnus, who was the genius scientist who put them together in the first place, you see the following issue, he'd be reconstructing them, he'd be rebuilding them. So I knew, being that these guys are mechanical beings, if I ever wanted to bring them back, or another writer wanted to bring them back, they could be rebuilt. It wasn't the end of the line for all these guys, so they weren't organic creatures, they were mechanical, they could be fixed in theory. So anyway, all that sort of entered into my thinking for that particular story. And Boltax is named after my very good friend, Janet Boltax, by the way.
Okay. Wow. So it's like, so a lot of the names that a lot of people have always asked, like, I guess, did you come up with some of the, not just the names that I've already come up with, but I guess some of the names of characters and even some of the secondary characters that weren't even made as toys. I guess they had a lot of connection to whom you were, like people you knew, if like you had like a friend, like you said, Jen Boltax or whatever.
I said to Janet, your name is perfect. Your last name, Boltax, is perfect for the Transformers.
And she probably, I wonder how she took it.
Oh, she loved it. In fact, recently, about a year or two ago, she had 3 grown kids now. She said, I don't know, the subject of that old comic book came up, and I said, well, I have extra copies. And she said, oh, I'd love to give one to each one. I'd love to give one to each one of my kids. So I gave her 3 copies of the comic book with Boltax in it.
Nice. So yeah, because that's the whole backstory, like of the whole Underbase, like where it came from, and what's kind of interesting is how your stories have like been throughout the entire Transformers universe, been used like throughout the franchise, even after you left the book. Like all the foundations that you made, not just the character profiles, but I think like the whole Underbase was used as a basis. They merged the Underbase with the creation matrix in the live action films. Merge the two of them in a way, like all knowledge and all, creating new characters, was kind of like merged in that way. Just kind of like a little weird tidbit. Now I guess you had already been on the book for 4 years and you wanted to get off, and then eventually you'd wanted to leave Transformers. I already know that they were writing the UK stories, which were all filler. Were you aware of the stories that were happening in the UK at the time, or was it more so your stories were getting sent over to the UK before you decided to like come off the book?
I was aware that there were UK filler stories, but I wasn't paying any attention to them.
Okay.
Because I was the one my job was working for Marvel, putting out a monthly book, and at least, by my standard, coming up with some kind of continuity within my book. I could not be worried about what was happening completely independent of me, several thousand miles away for a completely different market.
Okay.
So I didn't pay any attention to him. If you asked me about a particular storyline,
no, it wasn't good. It was more
I would have no clue what you're talking about. However, I did meet on at least one occasion while I was writing the Transformers, Simon Furman, who was a writer on the filler material for the UK market. And he came to visit the Marvel offices. And I'm sure he's told these stories on his own interview.
Sorry.
So he came over, I met him, we chatted, I remember specifics. In February of '89, I went on vacation to England, and I going through southern England with a friend, and we were going to wind up in London. So I arranged to meet Simon for lunch. And I'd been trying to get off the Transformers book for months because I felt like I had kind of been running out of ideas. The burden of continuing to introduce more and more characters was just crushing me. I was just like, I can't come up with new ways to introduce yet more characters. It was very frustrating, as I kind of mentioned earlier, to put aside other characters that I developed into certain narratives, and felt that I can no longer continue those characters, but I have to make room for more characters.
Yeah.
So between that and, just feeling like I'd been running this book long enough, and I had other ideas for another book that I wanted to do, so I needed to make some time in my schedule. I really wanted to get off the book, and I was begging my editor to find another writer. And then he would beg back at me. He said, I can't think of anyone else who could possibly write this book. You have to continue writing it, so I'd stay on the book. Anyway, in February of '89, I met Simon. We met for lunch in London, and over burgers and beer, as he puts it, I said, Simon, do you want to write the book? I'm done with it. I'm ready to leave. And he jumped at the opportunity. And then when I went back to New York City to the Marvel office after my vacation, I went to the editor, Don Daly was the editor at the time, and I said, Don, I got Simon Furman to agree to write the book. Are you okay with that? And so he agreed to that, and that's when I exited the book. I finished up whatever I was doing, and Simon took over the American, the writing of the American book.
He kept it going.
I hear he's still involved. Yeah.
I think he's still involved in stuff. Yeah. He now, did you, when you were off the book, were you like, that was it? Transformers is you, like the blinders are on, or is there any bit of storyline that that kind of like you kind of heard from the grapevine, like of what?
No, happened? I was done with it. I respect Simon. I didn't read his books. I didn't read his stories. I didn't follow mine. For a couple of reasons. One is I had other things to do. I had a full-time editorial job, and I was developing another book for Marvel. And,
Sleepwalker.
which became Sleepwalker.
Which, by the way, I love
Sleepwalker advertisements.
That's awesome.
Somebody made that for me.
Dude, that is so cool.
Yeah. So
I just read the first 6 because I needed to do a reread of Sleepwalker. I haven't read it in so long, and I reread the first 6 issues, and just recently, as part of the prep for the interview, but but I love the character. I'm like, where can we get them to develop a TV series or a movie for this character? Like, he's so awesome. Like,
there's a movie.
There is a movie, or
yes, it's a fan film.
Okay,
came out about a year ago.
Wow,
it's on YouTube.
I'm gonna have to look it up.
I have a cameo in it. It's live action.
That is awesome.
Yeah, and the guy behind it, his name is Josh Knopf. Josh got real film crews, real actors, special effects. It's a half-hour mini movie, and now he's planning second episode. In fact, cool. I'm going to be seeing him in a week from today. I'm going to see him next Saturday. He lives in Tampa, Florida.
Wow.
I'm going down to Tampa, not to see him specifically, but I'm going for other reasons.
Okay. So
you can look it up, or if you can't find it, I'll find a link for you. But
okay.
You did a really good job.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That is awesome. I would love that, because I doubt that Marvel wants to do any official thing at this point. So but you know what? You
can't discount anything with Marvel. So I feel like Marvel's full of surprises, and Marvel has proven that they could take any character and make $1 billion franchise out of it.
True.
So they don't all have to be Spider-Man, and Spider-Man is not even Marvel Studios. But they don't all have to be Iron Man or whatever. They Guardians of the Galaxy or Ant-Man.
Now, you were editor for Spider-Man during the whole Clone Saga, right?
Yes.
Were you? I loved the Ben Reilly stories myself personally. Now, do a lot of people have any fond memories, I guess, of that saga during Spider-Man, or is there a lot of roller coaster responses?
It's a pretty controversial run of Spider-Man, and I understand why. I came in the middle of that Clone Saga.
Okay.
There was already a Spider-Man team of editors and writers who had started pushing this storyline forward, And Marvel was going through a shakeup in 1994, editorial shakeup. And I won't bore you with the details, but basically Marvel's editor-in-chief was divided into 5 chiefdoms. And I became the editor of the Spider-Man chiefdom.
Okay.
Editor-in-chief of Spider-Man. And so I walked in the middle of the storyline, and there were certain things going on that I felt, well, I guess we have to, I frankly didn't like what was going to happen. And with 2020 hindsight, I should have stopped it. But I felt like, these guys have been working on Spider-Man for years. They have a lot of experience. We'll, let it play out. And it played out. And so when we did the old switcheroo that the clone was the real Spider-Man, the real Peter Parker,
right.
Peter Parker we've been featuring all these years in the comic books is really the clone. People hated it.
Yeah.
Fans felt like they were really ripped off, like, they were blindsided by it. They felt like it delegitimized years and years of Spider-Man stories that they'd been reading because it wasn't the real Spider-Man.
Right.
And what can I say? It was like I really should have figured out a way to like nip that storyline in the bud, and I didn't.
Yeah.
And if you want to dig a little deeper on that storyline and how it came to be, it's all Superman's fault.
Huh.
I'll tell you why. So around 1992, I think
they killed him, right? When they killed Superman.
Superman, exactly. Now, nowadays, if you turn on the television and you watch some talk show, whether it's a late night talk show or a daytime talk show, and they have on as guests, whoever, whatever actor or actress is in the next Marvel movie or TV show or whatever, it's no big deal. Like, these guys are all over television. They're talking about the box offices and all that. Back in 1992, for a comic book character to be mentioned on a mainstream television show was really unusual. And so at the time, when the death of Superman became a big item, not only within the comic book world because we're selling, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of comic books, but it actually, I believe, was featured as a segment of the Today Show.
Right.
NBC's Today Show at that time. So that was like a big leap forward for comic bookdom. Like, wow, they're talking about a comic book storyline on the Today Show. So immediately Marvel had an executive meeting, the president of the company, the head of our press relations, whatever her title was, and, top editors, executive editors, me and others. And what can we do to get that kind of attention in our comic books? I remember I was at the meeting. I was really quiet because I was a special projects editor. I didn't edit regular mainstream books. Right. So none of my books would make any kind of impact like that. But anyway, eventually what came out of that meeting was somebody suggested, I won't mention the name of who I think was guilty of it. Somebody mentioned, I got an idea. Mary Jane and Peter Parker have been married for a few years. They'll have a child. That's what came out of that.
I would have liked that to happen personally, but yeah.
You would have what?
I would have liked for that to happen. Like if Spider-Man himself, like actually had a kid, at the time, because I felt like, because I was reading a lot of Spider-Man at that point, and I liked the idea of Spider-Man getting, like he's married. Why not just have him have a kid? Like, like the idea of a hero, like kind of he has a day job kind of thing. He's out there saving the day. But go ahead. Anyway, continue.
Well, anyway, so this is probably around somewhere in 1993 or something. Anyway, I'm still not involved with Spider-Man at all, but because of that decision, that by having an event where Mary Jane and Peter have a child, somehow that's going to get some media attention and help sales. And it was so misconstrued,
right.
Frankly, the audience for the Today Show are not going to go out and start buying comic books. It might make a good segment, but it's not going to really change a lot in terms of everyday comic book sales because that's not our audience. Okay. But in any case, because of that, what happened was, independent of that, one of the Spider-Man writers came up with the bringing back the clone, and that became the Clone Saga. And as that story went along, Mary Jane got pregnant. Okay. And then when she got pregnant, the Spider-Man team, again, I'm not involved yet, decided, maybe it's not a good idea for Peter Parker, the real Peter Parker, Spider-Man, to become a father, because that's just, unlike you, Joe, that will just separate Spider-Man more from his core audience.
Right.
They'll have a harder time accepting him as a dad. Better that he's just a person without a child to have the responsibility. He's not He's not part of a family. He's just Spider-Man. He's married to this beautiful, sexy Mary Jane, but they don't have kids yet. So because of that, he decided, okay, this is the way out of this corner that we built in for ourselves. The way out of it is we're going to switch it so that Peter Parker and Mary Jane have the baby, but it's not the real Peter Parker. He's the clone. You follow?
Yeah,
it's
right.
pretty convoluted, but
Yeah.
this is what led to that decision, that they were going to switch the clone and Peter Parker because they didn't want Spider-Man to become a daddy.
Which is crazy to think, because like they actually undid their marriage in the mid 2000s, and
they
then
had to do a lot of things. Yeah,
and
for
me, in a lot of ways, like I was okay with the Clone Saga the way that it played out by the end. Like, during it was kind of a mess, but at the end it was fine because they made Mary Jane and Peter Parker, was Peter was the real one all along.
Yeah.
And then that the clone getting Ben was the clone and Ben died.
Yeah.
But they end up having the baby be the stillborn. And it was just like, no, why did you do that? Why did you have that happen? And then they never had Peter and Mary Jane have a kid after that. And then they decided to, around I think after the whole Civil War thing where Spider-Man's identity gets shown to the world, they decided to undo that storyline by having him all of the years that Spider-Man had during the 80s and the 90s was erased because it was all because in order to they split Mary Jane and Peter Parker without actually divorcing them, because they felt that a divorced Peter Parker would have been aged just like a dad Peter Parker would have been too aged. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, but it's real life.
Well, there's all different ways of looking at it, and I understand. I'm more sympathetic to the idea that, and I'm just saying it's me, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. You create a status quo for a character,
mm-hmm.
and you can do all sorts of things with that character, but ultimately you have to get back to the status quo. And so if you want to change the status quo, you really have to figure out, is this a change that's going to be a positive change or not?
Right.
And the thinking among the Spider-Man crew when I came aboard was, we don't want him to be a daddy, even though we're planning for him to be a daddy. We don't want him to be a daddy because it's going to remove him further from his audience. And if you take that logic even further, we don't want him to be married because, again, his audience is probably, it's changed over the years. But,
yeah.
Back then it might have been college age or high school age young men who aren't married. So we don't want Spider-Man to come. But at that time, Spider-Man was living his fantasy life anyway. He has this gorgeous, beautiful wife, and she's always showing up in, skimpy outfits. And
that's an interesting story on how they got together to begin with.
Yeah.
I've been, like I said, I've been following Spider-Man probably just as much as Transformers. So it's when I think about the death of Gwen Stacy and how important that event was, and why even Mary Jane is with Peter Parker to begin with. So,
and the death of Gwen Stacy was a really good story.
It was.
It didn't take away from Spider-Man. It made him more tragic, but he was already a tragic figure to a large degree, and it added to that burden. It really didn't change the status quo. And then, Mary Jane was waiting in the wings anyway.
Right.
But look, we can go back and forth on what direction Spider-Man should or shouldn't go. I mean, I have nothing to do with Spider-Man these days. It doesn't matter to me. But at the time, I really felt like, and this is perhaps to be read as an excuse, I was given lemons. I did my best to make lemonade out of it.
Right.
And if I'd stayed at Marvel a little longer, we had some meaning myself, my editorial team, my writers, we had plans to regain part of the status quo, but it never came to fulfillment because I wasn't there anymore.
Right.
And somebody else took over the reins.
Because you had left Marvel by that point.
Yeah.
And then you ended up living a pretty interesting life outside of the public light. I guess you could say, right?
I just went on with my life. I wasn't there to be there for the public. I was just trying to, make a living.
Well, I say that is because you were so influential for Transformers. And then you went off and created an amazing character like Sleepwalker, and then you had your hand in a lot of Spider-Man stories. You also had your hand in Ghost Rider too, but before that point. And so you have for a lot of us as Transformers fans, or even just Marvel comic book fans, you're actually a lot more important than I think that you give yourself credit for. I think from what I can tell, because
I know I've had an impact on especially Transformers fans, and anybody that's out there who's a Sleepwalker fan knows I'm the person behind Sleepwalker. But I'm just saying, when I did it, and now we're talking about it several decades later. And at the time I did it, I didn't know that Transformers would be around all these decades later.
Yeah.
I was just doing it because that was my job, and I was trying to do a real good job. And we sold a few books, and we had some fans, and then that went by the wayside, and I moved on to the next thing. So I'm just trying to be like realistic about it. And I know now in retrospect, because I go to Transformers conventions, I go on podcasts like this, and so on and so forth, that there are lots of people out there who are really influenced by the work I had contributed to. And that's great.
It does not go unappreciated. Believe me, I'm telling you. Like I want you to know how much it's appreciated. You know what I mean?
Oh, thank you.
And not just for myself, from so many of us who have grown up with Transformers, especially back in the 80s, whether it was the comic books or there was the cartoon. Like I grew up on the cartoon, and like I'm wearing the shirt for the movie, which a lot of those characters didn't show up in the Marvel books until they became Target Masters. But those characters, and a lot of these characters, like that's why I go by RodimusPrimal, is because like one of the main characters there, Rodimus Prime, was a major character. But even so, you created so much of the history and the backstory of Transformers that it shapes everything as the franchise continues to grow. And my hope is that like when some people go and bring up something like Car Wash of Doom, I go, yeah, but he also created the bios of
some people
how
like
many
that
characters.
story.
What's that?
There are people who liked that story. Who
I'm saying, like, when people bring it up in a negative light,
yeah.
I love the story. I love the stories when Megatron was a gun. In particular issue 13, where Megatron was like stuck in gun mode, and he ends up getting used creatively that way. And then in issue 23 with Aerial Bots Over America, where like he has a human carrying him, into Hoover Dam. I thought that was a creative way to use him in gun mode that way, because you have a character that's a giant robot, but then turns into a small, a handheld gun. Like, how do you create stories like that? But that's creativity for you, and no matter how you look at it, it's creativity, and it's your hand is on it. No matter, even if you didn't create the toys, you created these characters, and that they are more than just toys now, because of the work that you've done.
Well, thank you for saying all that. And that was my goal, which was to make them more than just a toy running around bopping each other in the heads. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to do, was trying to flesh them out and give them real personalities and make them characters that you can care about. That's
the thing. People look at them like they look at these Transformers as their people.
Yeah, well, then if that was the case, then I succeeded. That's good.
And I think you've done a good, really awesome job of that. And with that, I think we've gone on for quite a while, and I can go on. Believe me, I could talk Transformers all day, all night, and maybe I'll have you on again, and we can talk about stuff that we didn't talk about this time. And what do you guys think? Thank you guys. Thank you very much, Bob, for showing up on on the show. It's much appreciated. Once again, your work has gone, and I hope to have you on again.
Okay. Just figure it out, and we'll try again if you want.
Yeah. So until next time, guys. Until all are one.